In the fall of 1929, workers broke ground on what would become one of the most architecturally striking train stations in North America, the Cincinnati Union Terminal. A half-dome structure, so massive, so geometrically precise, that engineers who visited after its completion spent years trying to work out how the original builders had achieved that kind of acoustic perfection without modern calculation tools. What the history books remember is a beautiful Art Deco station. What they leave out is what happened during those first weeks of excavation, before the foundation pours began, before the steel frame went up, and before someone made the decision to have certain sections of the subterranean access welded shut by the end of that first working week. There are accounts from construction workers, passed down through family members in the Cincinnati area, describing what was pulled from the earth at that site. Not artifacts in the archaeological sense. Not pottery shards or colonial remnants. What they describe is infrastructure, tunnels with finished walls, chambers with curved ceilings, passages that ran at angles which did not correspond to any known utility grid for that part of the city. And then, by Friday of that first excavation week, a decision was made somewhere above the level of the site foreman, and the crews were redirected. The openings were sealed, the schedule moved on. This is the story the Cincinnati Union Terminal was built on top of. The official record of the Union Terminal's construction begins cleanly in 1929, with the architectural firm Fellheimer and Wagner appointed to design the structure, and groundbreaking celebrated as a modern civic achievement. Cincinnati was positioning itself as a gateway city, a hub between the industrial East and the expanding Midwest, and a grand unified station was the symbol the city needed. The project was funded, the land was cleared, and the excavation began. What the official record does not account for is the nature of the land itself. The terminal sits on a flattened bluff above the Mill Creek Valley, a site that had been occupied, cleared, and occupied again multiple times before the 20th century arrived. But the clearing that happened in the months before construction was not a simple matter of demolishing old buildings and grading the earth. Workers encountered something underneath the surface that slowed the excavation considerably during its first phase, a delay that was logged in internal construction records as a geological complication. That phrase, geological complication, gets used in early 20th century construction documents whenever the actual explanation was something the project managers did not want formalized on paper. Former residents whose grandparents worked that site in 1929 have described the geological complication in different terms. One account, recorded by a local historian in the 1970s and housed in the Cincinnati Historical Society's oral archive. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Describes a grandfather coming home after that first week and telling his wife they had found rooms down there. Not cavities, not sinkholes. Rooms with walls that had been worked. Smooth walls, and a floor that was still level after however many years it had been sitting in the dark. Another account from a separate family describes a grandmother recalling her husband returning from that first Friday on the site and saying that the foreman had told the crew not to discuss what they had seen and that the subject was not to come up again inside the project office or anywhere near it. The speed of that instruction matters. Construction projects in 1929 were not known for having airtight information management cultures. Workers talked, foremen gossiped. The labor pool in Cincinnati was not large enough that crews could be silently shuffled without anyone noticing. For a site-wide silence instruction to be issued and apparently respected that quickly, it would have required either a financial incentive significant enough to ensure compliance, or an authority high enough that workers understood the instruction was not optional. That is not the response to a geological curiosity. That is the response to something someone at a level above the construction site already had a category for. The Tartarian framework asks a question that mainstream historians have not seriously engaged with. What if the cities we think we built were constructed on, over, and sometimes inside the remnants of a prior global civilization whose infrastructure was so advanced that we have been quietly demolishing and repurposing it for the last 2 centuries, while telling ourselves we built everything from scratch. The Cincinnati Union Terminal is one of the case studies that keeps surfacing in that conversation, and not without reason. Consider the dome itself. The main concourse dome of the Union Terminal spans 180 feet in diameter and rises 106 feet at its peak. The acoustic properties of that space are documented and exceptional. Sound travels through the rotunda in ways that engineers have described as counterintuitive, given the materials and construction methods used. Whispers spoken at one side of the dome's base can be heard clearly on the opposite side, a phenomenon that requires extraordinarily precise geometric calculation to achieve intentionally. When asked how Fellheimer and Wagner accomplished this, architectural historians generally attribute it to inspired design and good fortune. Inspired design and good fortune is also what you say when you cannot explain something but are not prepared to question the official timeline. The half-dome form itself is significant. It is not a shape that emerges naturally from the design vocabulary of 1,929 American train stations. The period favored long, barrel-vaulted shed roofs, classical colonnades, Beaux Arts facades. The Union Terminal's sweeping semicircular face and massive central dome had few precedents in contemporary American architecture. The firms that designed it were not known for pushing geometric boundaries. The structure they produced looks less like something designed from scratch in a Cincinnati drafting room and more like something that was adapted from an existing form, perhaps one that was already partially present on the site. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. In the Tartarian reading of architectural history, the half-dome appears repeatedly as a signature element of the prior civilization's civic buildings. You find it in structures across different continents that the mainstream narrative dates to wildly different periods and attributes to wildly different cultures. What the Tartarian framework suggests is that the consistent appearance of this form is not coincidence and not independent parallel invention. It is because these buildings share a common origin, and in some cases the 20th century structures we celebrate as modern achievements are not new buildings at all. They are rehabilitations, cleaned up versions of what was already there, faced with new brick and steel, given new interiors, and presented to the public as triumphs of contemporary engineering. The welding shut of the access points found during the 1929 excavation fits this pattern precisely. It is not the behavior of people who found an empty geological oddity. You do not weld shut a natural cave formation by the end of the first working week. You document it, you bring in geologists, you assess the structural implications for your foundation plan. The speed of the sealing decision, and the apparent authority it required, suggests that whoever made that call had a clear idea of what had been found and a clear reason why it needed to be out of sight before the general construction crew had too much time to think about it. What was down there? The oral accounts vary in their specifics, but align on certain details. The passages were not horizontal in the way that utility tunnels are horizontal. They moved at grades and curves that suggested they were designed for something other than maintenance access. The walls, in the sections that workers were able to enter before the sealing order came down, were finished to a degree that rough-cut limestone or brick are not. Several accounts mention a surface that felt almost vitrified, as though the stone had been subjected to intense heat or some other hardening process that left it smooth and almost glassy to the touch. One account mentions a faint smell, not of decay or stagnant water, but something closer to ozone, the way the air smells before a lightning strike. Vitrification is a detail that comes up repeatedly in Tartarian research across multiple unrelated sites. The process by which stone achieves a glassy, fused surface requires temperatures that open-flame construction techniques of the pre-industrial era could not generate at the scale required to finish an entire tunnel wall. The presence of vitrified surfaces in underground passages has been documented at sites in Scotland, in India, and in parts of the American Southwest, always attributed by mainstream archaeology to natural geological processes or to the localized effects of ancient defensive fires. But fire does not selectively vitrify only the interior walls of a human-built passage while leaving the surrounding geology untouched. The city of Cincinnati has its own subterranean history that the mainstream narrative does acknowledge in part. There is the famous subway tunnel system, the Cincinnati subway, begun in 1920 and abandoned incomplete in 1927 before the Union Terminal project began. Sections of that subway system still exist under Central Parkway, sealed and occasionally open to curious visitors on official tours. The city knows it has tunnels. What is notable is what the city does not discuss, which is whether the abandoned subway construction encountered anything unexpected in its own excavation, and whether any of those findings informed the decisions made when the Union Terminal site opened up 2 years later. There is a geographic connection here worth examining. The Cincinnati subway's proposed route and the Union Terminal site are not far apart. Construction crews working on the subway in the early 1920s and construction crews breaking ground at the terminal site in 1929 were operating in the same general subsurface environment, a landscape shaped by the same glacial and pre-glacial geology, underlaid by the same layers of limestone that characterize the Ohio River Valley. If unusual chambers and passages existed under one work site, the probability that they existed under the adjacent one is not zero. And if the subway excavation had already turned up something that prompted a policy decision about how to handle such findings, then the speed of the welding order at the terminal site begins to make more sense. It would not have been a new problem requiring a new decision. It would have been a returning problem, handled according to an already established protocol. The broader Tartarian picture that Cincinnati fits into is one of intentional geographic selection. The locations chosen for the grandest civic buildings of the late 19th and early 20th centuries cluster in ways that suggest the builders, or the decision-makers above the builders, were following a prior map. River confluences, elevated bluffs with command views over valleys. These are the locations where the most ambitious terminal, courthouse, museum, and exhibition structures of the American industrial period went up. The argument is that the people with the capital and authority to commission these structures were selecting sites based on criteria that were never made fully public, and that those criteria included what was already present underground. Cincinnati itself sits at one of the most significant geographic intersections in the continental interior. The Ohio River at Cincinnati is fed by multiple tributaries converging within a radius that would have made the location a natural center for any civilization operating across the eastern half of the continent. The bluffs that ring the river valley create a natural amphitheater of elevated ground, the kind of defensive and observational high ground that every advanced civilization has preferentially settled. You do not build your most important subterranean infrastructure under unremarkable ground. You build it under the ground that matters most, and then you build the next civilization's most important public buildings directly on top. Cincinnati Union Terminal opened in 1933. It was celebrated as one of the great achievements of American public architecture. Over the following decades, as rail travel declined, the building fell into disuse. It was nearly demolished several times. Eventually, it was repurposed as a museum center, and its grand concourse now houses natural history, and children's museum exhibits. Millions of visitors have walked through that rotunda without knowing what the ground beneath them may contain, without knowing that, in the first week of the excavation that made room for the building they are standing in, workers found something that someone, somewhere above the level of the construction site, decided needed to be sealed before the week was out. The mosaics inside the terminal are worth a final consideration. Designed by Winold Rice and installed during construction, the murals and mosaics that line the concourse depict Cincinnati's history and industry in stylized, almost iconographic form. What has been noted by researchers working in the Tartarian framework is that several of the compositional elements in these murals, the geometric framing devices, the arrangement of human figures in relation to architectural backdrops, the use of specific repeating motifs along borders, share visual grammar with decorative traditions that mainstream art history assigns to cultures separated by centuries and oceans. The official explanation is that Rice was a sophisticated designer drawing from multiple global influences. The alternative explanation is that he was, consciously or not, working from a visual language that is older than any of the individual cultures it has been attributed to, a common symbolic vocabulary that surfaces wherever the infrastructure of the prior civilization surfaces, because the two things were never entirely separate. The concourse stands. The dome rises 106 feet above the terrazzo floor, somewhere beneath the foundation, behind welds that have now been in place for nearly a century. The passages that slowed down the 1,929 excavation are still there. Whatever was found in them during that first week was deemed significant enough to require a decision made faster than any geological complication would normally require. The building was finished on schedule. The history was written around what was left out. And what was left out has been underground ever since, in a city that has known about its tunnel